In our introduction to this series, we learned that Bob Dutko, evangelical Christian radio talk show host and apologist, believes there are 10 top proofs for why the Bible is true. Truth, for Bob, apparently means that the Bible is accurate regarding any and all scientific, historical, or prophetic claims that it makes. In this episode, we will be beginning our examination of those top 10 proofs for why the Bible is true, starting with
Number 1, the amazing amount of corroborating manuscript evidence for the Bible. You know, the New Testament alone has over 24,000 corroborating manuscripts documenting the events of the New Testament alone. Remember, before the printing press, history was passed down generation to generation orally, as well as occasionally being written down. Scripture, Old Testament and New, was written down by the original writers, and then later scribes would carefully and meticulously rewrite word for word what was originally written.
We should stop Bob here, just so listeners don't get the wrong idea. Whatever the original versions of the stories of the Bible were, they were never first written down, as we have them today, and simply copied over and over again through the centuries, word for word, without alterations or changes. This is such a simplistic, idealized view of the evolution of the biblical books that it verges on the comical. No reputable Bible scholar believes what Bob just said. For example, it is plainly obvious that the flood story of Genesis 6 and 7 is not a single, coherent narrative. The core legend floated around as an oral tradition, subject to expansions and revisions as retold generation after generation, until at least 2 of these stories were eventually compiled into written literary works. One adaptation of the tale was likely the authorized version of the northern kingdom of Israel, while the other circulated as the authorized version of the southern kingdom of Judah. At some point, these 2 versions came together into a single manuscript, knitted together by an editor or school of editors, as one version could not be considered the only authoritative rendition of the tale. This was the nature of an oral society. It was this finalized, somewhat awkwardly edited version of the flood story which became fixed in our Bibles today. And the same is true regarding the many other oral traditions that circulated among the various Jewish communities before they were set to pen. To suggest that what we have in our modern Bibles is a reasonable duplicate of the very original versions of these traditions, as if there was ever only one version of a particular story faithfully and exactly maintained down through the centuries, is flatly untrue, and highlights the ignorance one has for the historical development of the Bible.
These are the manuscripts. The fact that these manuscripts were written later doesn't invalidate the accuracy of the history of the Bible. Remember, historians have long understood that later manuscript evidence of historic events written before the printing press carries strong historical weight.
Again, we'll stop Bob here to note that he does not offer examples of any historians that make such a claim.
For example, do you know the 2 earliest biographies of Alexander the Great were written 400 years after his death in 323 BC? Yet historians don't question the historical accuracy of the biographies of Alexander the Great. The Iliad by Homer is considered one of the most historically sound course of events in history. Yet there's only 643 corroborating documents and manuscripts to the Iliad by Homer. The earliest was written 500 years after the events. Yet historians don't question the historicity of the events in the Iliad by Homer.
How many manuscripts exist which recount the story of George Washington chopping down a cherry tree? Do the number of manuscripts argue positively for the historicity of the tale when we know that the story is a fiction? And while Dutko mentions the biographies of other ancient figures like Alexander being taken seriously by historians, what historian can Dutko name who takes Plutarch's account of Alexander's conception by a snake as accurate history, or, to use Dutko's term, true? Or which historian can Dutko name who accepts as historically accurate the account of Achilles' conception by Peleus and the sea nymph Thetis? It's plainly obvious where Dutko is going with this so-called first proof for the truth of the Bible.
The New Testament of the Bible alone has over 24,000 corroborating manuscripts dating as early as less than a century after the originals themselves were recorded, and they were recorded as early as 15 to 25 years after the events by actual eyewitnesses and contemporaries of eyewitnesses during the lifetimes of other eyewitnesses that could refute any false claims. So the fact is, folks, the Bible, and especially the New Testament, is rock solid historically.
The problem here is that Dutko conflates accurate history with a large number of accurately transcribed manuscripts. The large number of manuscripts does not equate to an accurate history reflected in those manuscripts. Dutko claims the authors of the New Testament were eyewitnesses, but that is flatly untrue. First and foremost, the general consensus of New Testament scholarship is that the Gospels themselves are anonymous works. It cannot be said with certainty they were written by eyewitnesses. Secondly, the Gospels are theological, not historical, in nature. Even if they were written by people who knew Jesus personally, and even if they contained certain historical accuracies such as names and places, their intent was not to document as a historical biography the life of Jesus, and such claims as the miracles attributed to Jesus aren't necessarily true simply because the narrative of such miracles are set in a verifiable historical context. Thirdly, the earliest Christian documents we have in the New Testament are the letters of Paul, and Paul, by his own admission, as one untimely born, was not an eyewitness to any event in Jesus' life. Paul's Jesus is the Christ of faith, and he spends virtually no time in his letters discussing any historical event in Jesus' life. To corroborate means to support or help prove a statement, a theory, etc., by providing information or evidence. And if that is what the apologist is going for here, then there are huge swaths of the New Testament that do not fall into that definition. As noted, the letters of Paul recount nearly nothing about Jesus' earthly life. Large portions of the Gospels of Matthew and Luke are duplicated, in many cases word for word, from Mark, and therefore cannot provide corroboration of Mark's Gospel. How can an exact copy be an independent corroborating source? John's Gospel is hardly considered a reliable historical resource with its heavy theological underpinnings, and often stands at odds against Matthew, Mark, and Luke's accounts. Then you find disagreements among the Gospels on a variety of details. For example, did Judas or the temple priest purchase the potter's field? Bob takes the opportunity later in his series to address such contradictions in the Bible, and we too will examine those with him at the appropriate time. But a document can hardly count as a corroborating source if it requires an apologist to explain away its obvious discrepancies with the document it is supposed to corroborate. Bob goes on in his CD to list the sort of manuscript evidence we have for the Bible, starting with the Dead Sea Scrolls for the Old Testament, believed to have been composed between the 2nd century BCE and the 1st century CE, and then jumping immediately to the Codex Vaticanus from the mid-300s CE, failing, perhaps deliberately so, to mention that this and other codices contained books outside our modern New Testament, as well as excluded books from their collections Christians now consider canonical. For example, the Codex Vaticanus did not include the New Testament books of 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and Revelation. Additionally, even with the books from the New Testament the Codex Vaticanus did include, it was missing the following list of verses from those books. How do missing verses and entirely missing books support Dutko's argument that these manuscript copies were accurate representatives of the original? But perhaps more importantly, Dutko does not mention that a large number of the earliest manuscripts we have for the New Testament are actually just tiny fragments of possibly one of the Gospels or an epistle. There is no way to check for accuracy in the transcription of those manuscripts as a whole if we only have a sentence or two or just a partial paragraph from a much longer work. The text on these fragments, even if they do correspond with a passage from a gospel, however, might mean nothing more than that the contents of these few verses were already formalized, but that the fragment itself does not necessarily come from a much larger document, for example, one of the Gospels. So Dutko is already claiming far too much for what we actually have. In addition, the vast majority of those 24,000 corroborating manuscripts that Dutko boasts about are not in Greek. The original manuscripts of the New Testament were written in Greek. If we only consider the Greek versions of these fragments and not the translated copies into other languages, the number of corroborating manuscripts drops dramatically from the impressive 24,000 to about 5,800. While still a significant number, we have 0 confirmed manuscripts from the 1st century CE, the century of Jesus' life and ministry. By far the majority of these so-called corroborating manuscripts come from centuries later, and again, the vast majority of these manuscripts are fragments. When you actually dive into the claim being made regarding this manuscript evidence, while remarkable, it is not nearly as impressive as apologists like Dutko make it out to be. Besides, the number of manuscripts is simply a reflection of their popularity and says nothing about the accuracy of their recounting history. There are a very large number of copies of the Bible because the people who did the copying were Christians interested in preserving their sacred texts. We know for a fact that these manuscripts weren't copied word for word, and that editorializing sometimes crept into the text, especially early on. Probably the most famous example comes from the Gospel of Mark. As biblical scholar Bruce Metzger noted, the last 12 verses of the commonly received text of Mark are absent from the 2 oldest Greek manuscripts. Clement of Alexandria and Origen show no knowledge of the existence of these verses. Furthermore, Eusebius and Jerome attest that the passage was absent from almost all Greek copies of Mark known to them. It is obvious that later scribes copying Mark had no problem altering the text, inserting a more palatable ending to the Gospel, one more harmonious with the others. How can this be considered a corroborative effort? While in time both Christian and Jewish scribes copying their sacred texts considered every word and letter to have been divinely inspired, and so developed a complex system of checking, correction, and scrutiny when reproducing these texts, this sophisticated process, which gave us far more accurate copies of biblical texts than that of, say, Homer's Iliad, tells us nothing about the reliability of the contents of these texts. The same belief in the sacredness of the text also applies to the Quran and to those who made and make copies of Islam's most holy text. Will Dutko allow the fact that the multitude of corroborating manuscripts of the Quran argue for the truth of its claims? Rather than argue for the truth of the Bible with an appeal to the number of manuscripts for the biblical text using logic and intellectual reasoning, Dutko has done the exact opposite and argued by committing the huge logical fallacy of the non sequitur. The number of copies of a manuscript, even if copied perfectly down to every jot and tittle over a span of 10,000 years, would not be an argument for the accuracy of what that manuscript is reporting historically or scientifically. You could have a manuscript with 4 million exact copies stretching back millennia, which all agree the earth is flat, but that would not make the claim true. Bob's second proof for the truth of the Bible is actually no proof at all, and we will examine that in brief in our next episode. Funding for this program was provided in part by the generous contributions of viewers like you via Patreon. Consider joining them at www.patreon.com/Bible Skeptic. Thank you.